Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. All right, on with the show.
A listener's note. The following episode contains coarse language, adult themes, and content of a violent and disturbing nature, and may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
On December 6, 1917, Halifax was abuzz with activity as soldiers came and went from the front lines in France and the meat grinder that became the First World War. The residents of Halifax were going about their morning when they saw flames in the harbor. They stood at their windows to watch as a ship burned, and many moved closer to the shoreline for a better look. On board the burning ship, the crew screamed, not in pain, but fear. They were yelling for everyone to move back and to get away, but no one heard them. Less than half an hour later, the city was in ruins. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today I am sharing the story of the largest human-made blast in 1917, the Halifax explosion. This tale begins on June 21st, 1749, when Edward Cornwallis made landfall with 13 ships filled with settlers. The entire territory was the home of the Micmac people, who called the area of Halifax Chibuktuk, which translates to Great Harbor. European settlers established a community, and for over 150 years, Halifax grew and developed as it became one of the most important cities in North America. When the First World War began, Halifax was the jumping-off point for Atlantic convoys on their way to Europe with men and supplies. The war brought immense change, and the population boomed. The number of goods that passed through the harbor increased ninefold during that time. Included in that traffic were ships from neutral countries. Those ships had to be inspected by officials in Halifax prior to heading to their final destinations across North America. The day before the explosion, Halifax Harbour was abuzz with ships. There was the British ship Middleham Castle, which was venturing out of the harbour. Its spot at the dry dock was replaced by the Havland, a Norwegian ship, and while the Havland underwent repairs, the Picton, a British ship, waited. Two other British ships, the Curaca and Cologne, were nearby, also waiting for their turn at the dock. As the larger ships maneuvered, there were countless tugboats in the water, helping them navigate around the harbour. The Dartmouth II and Halifax II ferried people to and from the cities they were named for. On the northwest end of the harbour, there were another 50 ships in the Bedford Basin, all waiting to offload and onboard more cargo before they left for their final destinations. And one of those ships was a Norwegian vessel called the Emo. Built in 1889, the Emo was part of the White Star Line, the same company that built the Titanic. It was originally launched as the Runic, a cargo liner that carried 12 passengers and freight, typically livestock. By 1912, her owners renamed her as the Emo, a whaling supply ship. At the start of the First World War, it became a neutral charter ship with Belgian relief painted on the side to avoid misidentification as a warship and prevent it from being sunk by German submarines. She arrived in Halifax Harbour on December 3rd for neutral inspection and to pick up supplies. On December 5th, she was scheduled to leave the harbour, but a delay in coal delivery caused her to miss the window before the submarine nets went up for the night at the entrance to the harbour. The nets were a defense against offending armies, and once up, the Emo had to wait until the morning to venture out into the Atlantic Ocean. Had coal been delivered on time, the Emo would have departed on December 5th. But that is not what happened. Meanwhile, the French ship Mont Blanc waited out at sea. The next day, the two ships would have a date with destiny, and Halifax would be forever changed. The Mont Blanc launched the same year as the Emo, and she left New York on December 1st to join a convoy in Halifax loaded with explosives, including picric acid, gun cotton, benzene, and TNT. She was under orders from the French government to carry her cargo from New York City via Halifax to Bordeaux, France. A ship like the Mont Blanc, packed to the gills with explosives, would never be allowed in the harbor during peacetime, but the constant threat of German submarines outside the harbor had relaxed those rules. The sun barely had enough time to warm up the cool December 6th morning as ship traffic quickly picked up as soon as the submarine nets went down. Due to the number of ships in the harbor, ships going through the Bedford Basin were required to pass through the area known as the Narrows. Navigating this area is tricky and required the ships to pass the channel closest to their starboard side so they would pass oncoming vessels port to port, meaning they would pass on the left. All ships were also expected to move at a top speed of 5 knots or 9.3 kilometers per hour in the harbor. At 7:30 a.m., the Emo was cleared to depart the Bedford Basin by the HMCS Acadia, a guard ship in the harbor. Wanting to make up for the delay from the previous day, Captain Hakon maneuvered the Emo into the Narrows at a higher speed than was allowed. As the Emo moved through the harbor, she came upon the SS Clara, an American steamer that was being piloted on the wrong side. I don't know why the Clara was on the wrong side, but the two pilots agreed over radio to pass each other starboard to starboard rather than port to port. That decision pushed the Emo into the middle of the harbor and closer to the Dartmouth shore. At the same time, Francis McKee, an experienced harbor pilot, was on the Mont Blanc to guide it into the dock. The ship entered the harbor at 7:30 a.m. and was the second ship to do so after the nets went down. As it made its way in, it moved into the Bedford Basin on the Dartmouth side of the harbor. McKee watched the ferry traffic and the other small boats. Then he spotted a ship directly in front of him. It was the Emo. At about 1 kilometer from impact, McKee on the Mont Blanc sounded a signal whistle to indicate that his ship had the right of way. The Emo responded with 2 short blasts. That meant it was not going to yield its position. In response, McKee halted the Mont Blanc's engines and began to angle the ship towards the Dartmouth side of the harbor to avoid a collision. The Mont Blanc then let go another whistle to signal its right of way, which the Emo again responded to with 2 whistles. It quickly became apparent that they were heading on a collision course. The engines on both sides were cut, but vessels this large and heavy don't stop on a dime. They drifted on inertia towards each other. And while their speeds decreased as they approached, a collision became certain. Francis McKee steered hard to port across the bow of the Emo in the hopes of avoiding the ship. Meanwhile, the Emo blasted 3 whistles to state that it was reversing its engines. This was a standard practice, but in this case, instead of avoiding a collision, the Emo suddenly swung towards the Mont Blanc, and at 8:45 a.m., the two ships collided. And at first, nothing happened. Well, that's not entirely true. A few barrels of benzol fell, causing the lids of the barrels to pop off, and the chemical leaked over the deck and down the sides of the ship. Neither ship was in danger of sinking, so the captain of the Emo made a decision that changed history. He backed his ship up, and as he did, he caused a spark. Sparks were created by the grinding of metal on metal as the two ships separated, and they ignited the flammable fluid flowing over the Mont Blanc. A fire on any ship was dangerous, but nothing that couldn't be dealt with. But the crew of the Mont Blanc knew that this was not a minor incident. As soon as they saw the flames, they knew there was no stopping what was to come. They screamed at the approaching ships to stay away, but no one could hear them. They had no choice. They abandoned ship and swam for their lives. Meanwhile, the fire drew a crowd on shore as residents watched the unmanned Mont Blanc drift towards Pier 6 on the Halifax side of the harbor. The firefighting ship Stella Marie responded and sprayed the burning ship with its fire hose. 2 more ships that were nearby, the HMS High Flyer and the HMCS Niobe, joined in fighting the fire shortly after. Unfortunately, the blaze burned so hot a line could not be secured to the ship to tow it away from the pier. The High Flyer launched a whaleboat towards the ship with 10 men to fight the fire from a better angle. All the while, the Mont Blanc was red hot and getting hotter. On Pier 6, firefighters from West Street Station 2 arrived with the first motorized fire engine in Canada. About 250 meters from the fire in the harbor, Vincent Coleman stood outside his telegraph office. According to legend, a sailor ran by and told him that the Mont Blanc was packed with explosives. Coleman realized that if this was true, it would be catastrophic, so he returned to his post and sent out a message. There are many variations of this message, but the most common version states, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in the harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." Shortly after his message went out, at 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. This blast was unlike anything produced by humans before. It was the largest human-made explosion at the time, and at its epicenter, temperatures rose to 5,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. For a split second, water displacement exposed the bottom of Halifax Harbour to the open air for the first time in, well, maybe ever. The surging waters produced a tsunami that rose 18 meters above the water line. At the same time, a blast wave shot out from the epicenter at a speed of 1 kilometer per second. It carried the 90mm gun of the Mont Blanc 5.6 kilometers to the north, while the half-ton anchor of the ship landed 3.2 kilometers to the south. Other pieces, the size of shrapnel, landed 8 kilometers away. And as the blast wave passed through the harbor, it hit the ships that were nearby. The Emo was the closest ship to the Mont Blanc. It was thrown onto the beach, its upper decks were wrecked, and 3 of the 4 men on our open bridge were killed, along with 4 other crew members inside the ship. On the High Flyer, which responded to the fire with the Niobe, all but 1 crew member was killed. On the High Flyer's whaleboat, which had 10 men inside, 9 were killed. Only William Barker survived. Severely injured, he was able to make it to the Dartmouth shore. When the blast wave hit the Stella Marie, 21 of 26 men on the ship were killed, and the entire ship was thrown onto the beach. The blast wave continued to move away from where the Mont Blanc had once been, and hit a ship anchored in Halifax Harbour where John Tappan, a 19-year-old apprentice pipefitter, had just reached the deck to see 2 ships burning. The next thing he knew, he was down a corridor in the interior of the ship. He said, "When I regained my senses, I noticed all the buttons on my vest had been blown off." The blast wave then hit the beach and tore through everything in its path. The firefighters on Pier 6 were just unrolling their hoses when the blast wave hit them, killing all of the first responders. The only crew in the harbor to escape major injury were those who had been on the Mont Blanc. They abandoned ship before the explosion and made it to shore just as the ship exploded. Only 1 crew member died. After leaving the harbor, the blast wave pushed into the city. William Barton, a traveling auditor with the Imperial Munitions Board, was having breakfast at the Halifax Hotel when the blast hit. He said, "In 10 seconds it was all over. A low rumbling, a quake shock with everything vibrating, then an indescribable noise, followed by the fall of plaster and the smashing of glass. In such moments the human mind does not hesitate. A cry went up, a German bomb, a rush for the door, headlong down the hallway amid falling pictures, glass and plaster, to the swing doors of a few seconds before, now ripped from their hinges, through great projecting triangle pieces of glass to the street." Billy Wells, a local firefighter, was thrown through the air. He survived, but all his clothes were torn from his body. This was like what happened to 3rd Officer Myers of the British transport Middleton Castle. The ship was 180 meters from the Mont Blanc, and Myers was standing on the deck about to step into a small boat to go ashore when he was knocked out by the blast. When he regained consciousness, he was 800 meters away, and all of his clothing was gone. But he survived. Last year, the National Film Board released a short animated film, The Flying Sailor, that tells his story. It was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Animated Short, and it's free to watch on the NFB app, YouTube, and the NFB website. Meanwhile, with each fraction of a section that passed, the blast wave moved through the city, leaving a trail of destruction. The Acadia Sugar Factory, located near Pier 6, was reduced to rubble, and most of the workers inside were killed. The Nova Scotia Cotton Mill, located 1.5 kilometers from the blast, was destroyed, and its concrete floors collapsed, killing several workers. The Royal Naval College of Canada, built only 6 years earlier, was heavily damaged, and many students inside were maimed. The damage was so bad that the college was moved to Kingston in 1918. The Richmond railway yards and station were destroyed, killing 55 workers and destroying 500 railway cars. The Protestant orphanage suffered terribly, losing its matron and all but 2 children in the explosion. At the Richmond Printing Company, the building was destroyed and 30 women were killed. At the nearby Richmond School, children were getting ready to begin their day when the blast wave hit. Every child was killed except one, who was thrown through the ruins and landed unhurt. Cora Matheson was in her father's house when the blast wave hit. She was thrown through the smashed house and out into the road, suffering 2 broken legs. The Heffler family, scattered through Halifax that day, lost 20 members to that blast wave. Lola Burns was saying her morning prayers next to her bed when her home was torn from its foundation and collapsed around her. The timber above her formed a tent that protected her from being crushed. A 6-year-old child, unnamed in my research, was blown through the roof of his house by the blast wave, rolled down the roof of another house and fell on the ground and suffered only a few scratches on his cheek. By the time the blast wave passed through Halifax, nearly every building in the 800-meter radius around the harbor was rubble. It spread to the outskirts of the city where it tore off roofs, shook buildings nearly to their foundations, and smashed windows. Thousands of people were watching the fire in Halifax Harbour burn from their windows when the explosion hit. Seconds later, the blast wave hit their homes, smashing the glass. A total of 5,900 eye injuries were reported, leaving 41 people blind for life. And by the time the blast wave ended, 1,600 were dead and 9,000 were injured. Of those 9,000, another 300 died of their injuries. In a radius of 2.6 kilometers, 12,000 buildings were heavily damaged. And that blast wave was felt across Nova Scotia to Cape Breton, over 200 kilometers away, and was even felt in the neighboring province of Prince Edward Island, 180 kilometers away. After the blast wave, pieces of the Mont Blanc began to rain down. These red-hot bits of iron landed on homes and other buildings, starting fires throughout the city. Amid the explosion, stoves and lamps were also thrown through buildings, causing secondary fires to erupt across the city. In the north end of the city, entire blocks burned to the ground. At the Micmac settlement located near Halifax, 12 people were killed and nearly every structure was leveled. Africville, the black community that existed since the mid-19th century, was spared the direct force of the explosion thanks to the raised ground to the south of it. Unfortunately, due to the frailty of the buildings, many were still destroyed and 5 people died. Dartmouth, on the other side of the harbor, suffered heavy damage as well, with 100 dead and several buildings destroyed. As for Halifax, it became an inferno as the city was in the shadow of a huge mushroom cloud that rose 12,000 feet in the air. Throughout the city, fires burned, people were trapped in their collapsed homes, and parts of the city were left unrecognizable. The task of rescuing those trapped in their homes and other buildings began within minutes of the explosion. The first rescuers were those who survived the initial blast. Neighbors and co-workers dug out their friends and relatives. Soldiers, firefighters, and police officers stationed in the city joined in the rescue efforts. Private Henneberry had returned home from the front lines only days earlier. He was found digging frantically in the rubble and was reported to say, "Here was my home. I am sure I heard a moan a moment ago." Colonel McKelvey Bell had spent 2 years on the firing line in France, and he said he had never seen anything equal to the scene in Halifax. Another soldier, unnamed, had just returned home from the front. He found his wife and children dead. Rather than falling into despair, he committed himself to rescuing others. He said, "I must do something or go mad." Arthur Bemis had suffered a broken rib in the explosion, but he did not seek help. Instead, he used his car to transport the wounded all day until he finally collapsed and was taken to the hospital. While waiting for help from outside Halifax, people throughout the ruined city banded together moments after the disaster. Men and women volunteered in hospitals and shelters, while children ran messages between sites since the telegraph and telephone lines were all down. Nearly every vehicle in the city was put into service, including cars, delivery wagons, trucks, and more to collect the dead and wounded. A train from St. John was on its way to Halifax when the explosion occurred, but was only slightly damaged by the blast wave. It continued towards Halifax until it was blocked by wreckage. That's when passengers joined in the relief efforts. They took emergency tools and began to dig people out of the rubble around the tracks, using sheets from sleeping cars as bandages. The number of injuries was so high, hospitals were swamped with people, leaving doctors and nurses overwhelmed. They worked for days on end, with little rest. At Camp Hill Military Hospital, 1,400 people were admitted on December 6th alone. The Jabukto Road School became the central morgue. The Royal Canadian Engineers converted the basement of the school into a morgue and the classrooms into offices for the Halifax coroner and doctors as wagons and trucks delivered the steady stream of dead. In a rather interesting note, Arthur Barnstead was the coroner in charge, and he implemented a system created by his father, John Barstead, to number and describe the bodies, which was developed for victims of the Titanic who arrived in Halifax in 1912. For more information on the Titanic, listen to my episode about the Canadians on the doomed ship from January 2024. Meanwhile, as Halifax dealt with the injured and dead, news of the explosion filtered out into the rest of the world. The telegram Vince Coleman sent out just prior to the explosion and his death not only stopped a train filled with 300 people from entering the city, but it also got word out about the disaster before it happened by getting the message out onto the Intercolonial Railway. This allowed for rescue and relief efforts to start almost immediately. J.D. Reed, the Minister of Railways in Moncton, stated soon after word of the disaster reached him, "The fire is spreading. We are sending special trains out of Moncton, and every city with fire apparatus is also being called out. We are picking up fire apparatus between Moncton and Sydney and rushing into Halifax. The situation is bad. Every building north of the Queen Hotel is totally wrecked. North Street Station is in ruins, as well as our plant at Willow Park, and there is one massive fire wreckage and dead bodies in the north end of the city." The first relief train left Truro, Nova Scotia at 10 a.m., less than an hour after the disaster, with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. It reached Halifax by noon and returned to Truro with the wounded and displaced people by 3 p.m. 3 hours after the explosion, Nova Scotia Lieutenant Governor McCallum Grant and other leading citizens formed the Halifax Relief Commission. They organized medical relief for Halifax, providing food and shelter while also covering the costs of medical care and funerals. The Royal Navy turned their ships into floating hospitals as many wounded were brought on board. The United States quickly responded as well. The American ships, the USRC Morrow, the USS Tacoma, and the USS Von Steuben were all in the area when they saw the mushroom cloud on the horizon. The ships altered course to Halifax to help. The American steamship Old Colony was docked in the harbor and only suffered slight damage. It was turned into a hospital ship manned by American and British doctors. The city of Boston responded almost immediately. State Governor Samuel McCall sent a telegram to the mayor of Halifax stating, "Understand your city is in danger from explosion and conflagration. Reports only fragmentary. We stand ready to go to the limit in rendering every assistance you may be in need of. Wire me immediately." The executive manager of Boston's Committee of Public Safety, Henry Endicott, immediately called a meeting to discuss how aid could be offered to Halifax. Boston sent huge amounts of food, furniture, clothing, and medical supplies, as many doctors and nurses from various American hospitals arrived in the city to take trains towards Halifax to render their assistance and set up temporary hospitals. New York City sent a Red Cross relief train with 5 cars loaded with food, clothing, and medical supplies. And by the end of the day, a dozen trains had also reached Halifax from across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Meanwhile, the rest of Canada was doing what it could to help. In Winnipeg, Mayor Davidson immediately called for aid from citizens. Toronto's mayor offered relief when the lines were repaired later in the day. He telegraphed Halifax and said, "Please accept Toronto's deepest sympathy in the terrible calamity. Advise us forthwith what assistance and aid we can give you. We are all at your service and will dispatch any aid necessary by special train. Do not fail to call upon us. Toronto's heart goes out to you." King George V sent condolences stating, "Most deeply regret to hear of severe explosion at Halifax resulting in great loss of life and property. Please convey to the people of Halifax, where I have spent so many happy times, my deepest sympathy in this grievous calamity." Newspapers put out evening editions across Canada detailing what had happened in Halifax. Their reports came from people who left the city on outgoing trains hours after the disaster. The Montreal Gazette wrote, "Under the force of the explosion, houses crumpled while the unfortunate residents met death in the debris. In the west and northwest end, the damage was more extensive and the walls of houses were in place blown to atoms and the plaster strewn on the streets, making them more like a shelled section of Flanders than a Canadian town." The newspaper went on to describe the aftermath, stating, quote, "A few minutes after the explosion occurred, the streets were filled with terror-stricken people trying to make their way as best they might to the outskirts in order to get out of the range of what they thought would be a German raid. Women rushed terror-stricken through the streets, many of them with children clasped to their breasts. In their eyes was a look of terror as they struggled on with blood-stained, horror-stricken faces, endeavoring to get anywhere from the falling masonry and crumbling walls." The Windsor Star reported, "Weary survivors who have searched the temporary morgues for missing relatives went to hospitals to continue the heartbreaking hunt." The day after the explosion, Halifax looked like a war zone in France. Fires burned, hospitals were full with injured and those helping them, vehicles transported people and supplies as others transported the dead. Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden suspended his election campaign to arrive in his hometown first thing in the morning, where he had lost many loved ones. He had cancelled 2 meetings to rush to the city to consult with authorities and assist, while assuring the population of government help, which was later announced to be $1 million in relief funds. Borden also took time that day to send out a message of gratitude to Americans for their quick help. He said, The people of Canada are profoundly grateful for the generous sympathy of the United States in the terrible disaster which has overtaken the city of Halifax, and they most deeply appreciate the splendid aid which has been offered and sent from so many communities of our great kindred nation. Snow fell as the Prime Minister toured the streets he had walked as a child and young lawyer. It seemed that the immense human-made despair from the day before was not enough for Mother Nature. She brought a blizzard down on Halifax. The storm raged through the day and dumped 41 centimeters of snow on the city. Telegraph lines repaired late in the evening the day before collapsed under the weight of the snow. Some trains stalled until the snow could be cleared from the tracks. And while it may have been an insult to injury, the snow did help put out the fires that were raging unchecked throughout the city, a silver lining in an otherwise desperate hour. Once again, telegraph lines were repaired late in the day on December 7th to the stricken city. Almost as soon as lines were operational, they were swamped with messages from politicians, officials, and loved ones, all looking to get information on what had happened. But many didn't get through, as people across North America sent more, creating a bigger backlog. Also on December 7th, partial train service returned to Halifax, and 2 days later, on December 9th, full service was back. Supplies, doctors, and nurses streamed into the city throughout December 8th and 9th, same with the people looking for loved ones, as did everything from furniture and food from elsewhere in Canada. The help was appreciated, but it was creating a logistical nightmare. City leaders asked that anyone with no business in Halifax stay away, and that all residents not engaged in relief work leave the city as well. Following the disaster, people wanted to know what happened, because Halifax was very important to the war effort, and many residents believed that the explosion was a German attack. The helmsman of the Emo was arrested on suspicions of being a spy because he had a letter supposedly written in German. It turned out it was written in Norwegian. Within Halifax, German residents were rounded up and imprisoned by city police. Corporation Counsel T.A. Hunt said, "Any man who is disloyal to Canada should be shot. German enemies in this country should be lashed and shot. They would not get away with disloyal acts anywhere else." A few days after the disaster on December 11th, the Windsor Star stated, "All German citizens of Halifax are being arrested today, and they were ordered into custody regardless of sex. 7 men and 1 woman have been arrested up to the late hour last night, and others are being rounded up as rapidly as possible." Amid the cleanup and rebuilding, an investigation was also launched to find out what truly happened in Halifax on that fateful day. The Rec Commissioner's inquiry was created to investigate the cause of the explosion. Proceedings began on December 13th, 1 week after the blast, and was presided over by Justice Arthur Drysdale. On February 4th, 1918, the inquiry put blame mostly on the pilot of the Mont Blanc, Francis McKee, and the Chief Examining Officer of the Royal Canadian Navy, Commander F. Evan Wyatt, who oversaw the harbor, gates, and anti-submarine defenses. Justice Drysdale agreed with the opinion that the Mont Blanc was solely to blame for the explosion, as her crew should have avoided collision at all costs because of her munitions cargo, and even though the Emo was on the wrong side of the channel, it escaped blame in the inquiry. Francis McKee was charged with manslaughter and criminal negligence. Benjamin Russell, a Nova Scotia Supreme Court justice, found no evidence to support the charges, and no one was ever convicted. The owners of both ships then embarked on civil litigation, seeking damages. Justice Drysdale again ruled that the Mont Blanc was entirely at fault on April 27, 1918. Appeals went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and on May 19, 1919, and the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council on March 22, 1920, and it was eventually determined both ships were equally to blame. Within Halifax, damage was so extensive that a month later in January 1918, 5,000 people still had no shelter. The Reconstruction Committee eventually built 832 new housing units, which were furnished with donated furniture. But not everyone benefited from all that reconstruction. Years prior to the explosion, city leaders in Halifax tried to expand the city into Micmac land, and the Micmac always refused to sell. After the explosion, Micmac survivors were evacuated from the settlement and put into racially segregated buildings in poor condition. They were then dispersed around the province and never taken back to their settlement. Halifax eventually built onto their land without any compensation to those who had lived there prior to the explosion. As for Africville, the residents there received very little in the way of relief that came from the rest of the country, and those who applied for relief had their claims automatically reduced by 20% or ignored altogether. For Halifax, the explosion was deeply traumatic. There was a ceremony on the first anniversary of the explosion, but then there was none until 1967, on the 50th anniversary of the tragedy. The Halifax North Memorial Library was built in 1964 to commemorate the victims and featured the first monument to mark the explosion. Designed by Geordie Bonet, the Halifax Explosion Memorial Sculpture existed until 2004, when it was put in charge and fell into disrepair. In 2015, the remaining fragments were sent to the Bonet family. In 1985, the Halifax Explosion Memorial Bells were constructed, facing Halifax Harbour. It is around this bell tower that an annual civic ceremony is held every December 6th. Throughout Halifax and Dartmouth, fragments of the Mont Blanc are also mounted as monuments to the explosion. In 1994, historian Jay White looked at 130 major explosions in human history and used 5 criteria, including casualties, force of the blast, devastation, quantity of explosive material, and property damage values. White stated that the Halifax explosion was unrivaled in terms of the overall magnitude. It became the standard by which all large explosions were measured until the dropping of the atomic bombs. In fact, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Time magazine stated it had the power of 7 Halifax explosions. And it was a terrible event, but good did come from it. The extensive eye damage to onlookers of the explosion resulted in the creation of the Canadian Institute for the Blind in Halifax. It became an internationally renowned center as doctors in Halifax learned a lot about treating eye injuries after the explosion and helped many people in the coming decades suffering from eye injuries. Pediatric care after the explosion improved throughout North America thanks to William Ladd. He used what he learned during the relief effort to pioneer pediatric surgery in North America. The large number of premature births caused by the explosion also gave doctors valuable experience in ensuring the survival of babies born before their due date. The north end of Halifax was completely modernized after the disaster, with more public access to green spaces, as well as low-rise, low-density, and multifunctional urban neighborhoods. A total of 326 large homes were built facing a tree-lined paved boulevard, all of which were built from fireproof materials. This reconstruction caused the North End to become an upscale neighborhood and shopping district. And possibly, the most famous legacy of the disaster is the Boston Christmas tree. If you heard my episode in December, you'll remember that in 1918, Halifax sent a Christmas tree to Boston as a thank you to the city, and in particular, the Boston Red Cross. In 1971, the Christmas tradition was revived and is now an annual occurrence. The tree became Boston's official Christmas tree, and it is lit at Boston Common in the presence of the Mayor of Boston and the Premier of Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources also has strict guidelines, and one employee is chosen to oversee the selection. Having a tree selected from your property is considered a great honor and a bright spot of goodwill between the two communities. It's a beautiful tradition, spawned from one of the worst days in Canadian history. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the Halifax explosion. Information from Saskatoon Daily Star, Ottawa Citizen, Canadian Encyclopedia, Wikipedia, the Vancouver Province, Edmonton Journal, Montreal Gazette, the Regina Leader Post, Catastrophe, Halifax Public Libraries, Winnipeg Tribune, Windsor Star, Ottawa Journal, Maclean's, and the Vancouver Sun. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.